Hey, what's up, macro students? Mr. Clark with another video for you. This time we're going to dive into our final unit for the 2020 spring course. And that unit is going to cover Unit 5, which deals with short and long run economic growth. Essentially what we're going to cover here is we're going to take the topics that you've learned about over the last few units. We've learned about the different types of economic conditions that exist, the role of demand and supply in that, the role of monetary and fiscal policy and the various multipliers and policy tools at disposal, and what's going to happen when all those tools interact with one another or are used at the same time. What is the effect on interest rates, on investment, on aggregate demand, things like that. We'll also talk about, we're going to come back to that long run aggregate supply curve that we introduced way back in Unit 3. We talked about why it's vertical, and one of the things I didn't mention at the time in Unit 3 is what moves that long run aggregate supply curve. We'll talk about that later in the unit, and we'll also talk about some things related to a final curve known as the Phillips curve. It's one of our final graphs for the unit. We'll talk about the concept of crowding out, which we touched on very briefly in the last unit. Public policy, we'll talk about classical economics and Keynesian economics and supply side economics, all that good stuff. So topic one, what we're going to cover today, deals with fiscal and monetary policy actions in the short run. Essentially what topic one in Unit 5 looks at is it's really just gauging whether or not you know fiscal policy and whether or not you know monetary policy. And if you were to put the two together, what's going to be the effect on interest rates in some situations, like when, say, the Fed buys bonds and the government pursues contractionary fiscal policy. What's going to be the effect on interest rates? It's going to look at those things. So really, there isn't a lot of new knowledge here. What you really need to do is show if you were being tested on just topic one of Unit 5, can you apply the concepts of fiscal policy? Can you apply the concepts of monetary policy? So let's get into it. This is what I would start off with in class. What economic situations do these two graphs show? The graph here, I'm going to make this graph A, make this graph B. Okay, so graph A, because our short run equilibrium, the point where short run supply and short run demand intersect, because it intersects long run right here, you have what's known as long run equilibrium, meaning that your economy is at full employment and there is no cyclical unemployment at this point. Okay, now let's say that there is some demand pull inflation. Demand shifts to the right here, and so you go from this point, you go from full employment right here and over here. Right now, prices have increased. So you have some inflation there, and now here's Y2. And so because of that, because demand has increased and because prices have increased and GDP has increased, this would be an expansionary gap. Over here, graph B, at this point, because your short-run equilibrium isn't in line with long-run supply, this is known as what? This is a recessionary gap. This is known for falling GDP and, oh man, look at that handwriting. Perfect, beautiful. Falling GDP, falling price levels, and rising unemployment. All right, why am I bringing this stuff up? Because these are topics that you need to know about what the Fed and our government would do to correct those situations. So in the situation here, when you have an expansionary gap with graph A, where you have rising price levels, aka inflation, what would the Fed do? The Fed would pursue contractionary monetary policy. They're going to sell bonds. They're going to raise interest rates, the federal funds rate, the discount rate, reserve requirements. What's the Congress going to do? Congress is going to increase taxes. They're going to decrease spending. Again, the whole idea here, guys, is to decrease prices so that demand shifts back to where it originally started. It shifts back to full employment and thus creating deflation. Over here with graph B, what's the Fed going to do? It's just the opposite. They're going to buy bonds. They're going to cut interest rates, cut discount rates. Look at your organizer. They're going to make it easier for banks to borrow money to people. The Congress is going to cut taxes and increase spending with the idea of trying to put more money in people's pockets. One way of looking at this, if you want to be really simple with it, think of how this is the goal. This vertical line right here is the goal. So if you're ahead of it, how do you get it back there? Well, you got to bring demand back. You take money away from people. If you're behind it, how do you get the line? How do you get demand back to the vertical line? How do you get back to long run? Well, you give money to people. You stimulate the economy. You give it some steroids so it grows and becomes this big creature that dominates the macro economy. All right. Got to know the tools. I just mentioned them right there. Fiscal policy. You got to know taxes, government spending. That's Congress. Congress has two tools at their disposal. I listed them right there. Monetary policy. Open market operations. That's buying and selling of bonds. Know when the Fed uses them. Discount rate, federal funds rate. Reserve requirements. You got to know those tools. You got to know what the Fed has at its disposal to influence the macro economy. All right, next slide. Get my trusty little marker here. So if you look at this first bullet point under fiscal here, Congress is looking through their budgets and they see that the federal government debt is out of control. The government's spending way too much money. They're concerned about the debt. So if you were a politician and you're concerned about the debt, what are you going to do? How would you bring the debt under control? Well, you have to bring more money into your government, right? You have to spend less and take in more. So what does that mean? You're going to increase taxes and decrease government spending. Think about it, like, again, I try and tell you guys, think of it from your own point of view too. Like if you're getting your credit card statements and your credit card you're running this massive debt in your credit card, how are you going to pay that thing off? Well, you're going to stop going out to eat. You're going to stop buying things on Amazon. There's your spending. You're going to get spending under control, and you're going to try and work more. You're going to try and bring more money in. That's what the government's going to do here. They're going to try and raise taxes. So I have to talk my wife into it at this point because she's spending way too much money because she's just at home all the time. All right. If you want to increase the deficit, if you want to grow the economy, what are you going to do? You're going to try and put money in people's pockets by cutting taxes, and you're going to try and pay for those roads. So that's a really poor arrow there. You're going to try and increase spending on healthcare and bridges and infrastructure and government projects, things like that. And then if government spends a bunch of money, think about Woodstock North High School. When the district issued a plan to build a brand new high school in 2007, 2006, they didn't have millions of dollars laying around. They had to borrow it. So now that coincides with this. This is your loanable funds market graph, a graph which we learned about in the last unit. So if the government is spending more money, whether it's Woodstock School District, the U.S. government, the state of Illinois, which pretty much all government entities are doing right now because of the coronavirus. They're either paying more money out in unemployment or stimulus checks, or they're calling healthcare providers back in or paying National Guard troops, whatever. They're going to need to borrow more money. So the demand for loans, this market, guys, this graph is the graph and market for loans. When people need to borrow more, the demand for loans is going to increase. And so there, sorry for the delay. Man, that's a nice looking DLF right there. So you go from this point to this point. Look what's happened to your interest rates. Sure, there's more loans being taken out, But now the interest rate is higher. So that goes back to this point here. When the government increases their spending, when they're spending more money, that means they need to borrow more money. And so because of that, this leads to an increase in interest rates. The AP actually devotes like a whole section, a whole topic to this. This is called crowding out. I'm not even going to try and spell it here because it would be completely butchered and take way too long. But crowding out is an increase in interest rates when the government borrows money. So like right now, theoretically, because the government is borrowing a whole bunch of money to pay for those massive stimulus plans and the small business bailouts and the big business bailouts, really, the theory behind it is that interest rates are going to rise. Well, then we get into monetary policy. All right, so if the Fed's looking at that, let's say the same situation here. We're sticking with, get a different color. The Fed's looking at this. Let's apply the COVID-19 dilemma that we're in right now. The Fed sees this. They see the government doing the right thing. Obviously, yes, they should be trying to put money back in people's pockets. So what's the Fed going to do? They don't want interest rates to rise, right? They want to make it so that interest rates are low in this time so that banks can continue to borrow money to people and people continue to spend that money at low interest rates, low prices of borrowing. So then what they're going to do, give me a second here, sorry. What the Fed is going to do is they are going to buy bonds. And by buying bonds, this is going to pump money into the economy. Now banks have more money in their vaults, more money to lend. So now banks are willing to supply more loans. And now look what happens to counteract that rise in interest rates because of the government demanding more loans by the Fed getting involved. This brings back equilibrium. Interest rates once increased, now they've decreased, so now interest rates are pretty much back to where they were before. It keeps interest rates stable so the economy can stay stable. That's the point of all this, guys. You have to be able to interpret different macroeconomic situations using fiscal and monetary policy to determine an outcome. In this case, what's the outcome? What's the effect on interest rates? What's the effect on the deficit? Things like that. So if the Fed were to pursue a contractionary monetary policy and the government cuts taxes and increases spending, what's the effect on interest rates? To kill a little bit of time here, what I did is I drew a couple graphs for the next couple of slides. And so if the Fed wanted to take money out of the economy, they were concerned about inflation here. They're pursuing what's known as contractionary. They're trying to shrink the economy. But the government instead wants to expand the economy. So we got like competing ideologies here. We got different economic theories butting heads. What's going to be the effect on interest rates? So in this case, if the Fed is selling bonds, what they're going to do here is they're going to sell bonds, and by selling bonds, it's going to decrease the money supply. So now the rate of interest has increased. In this case, interest rates have increased. And if the U.S. government, what they want to do is they want to cut taxes and increase spending. And so by doing that, there's that crowding out theory that we talked about. They need to borrow more money because they don't have as much that they're taking in. They're giving more money back to the people, and they're spending more. So they're going to need to borrow more money. There's crowding out. So in both cases, interest rates have risen. And so the answer here is interest rates have went up. When the Fed sells bonds, increases discount rates, pursues contractionary monetary policy, and then the government does the opposite, interest rates are going to increase. And then for another scenario here, if the Fed and the government wanted to increase business investment, but at the same time they want to maintain price levels, what types of policy should they pursue? Well, what the Fed's going to do here is the Fed is, if they wanted to increase investment, anytime you see increased investment, think of if you were a business and you wanted to pursue new technology or computer software, or hire workers, or put the new roof on the factory. You don't have that money sitting around. You're probably going to have to borrow that money. And so in order to do that, you want a low interest rate. So that's the goal here. The goal is low interest rates if you're the Fed and the US government. So in order to do that, how would you lower interest rates? Well, you're going to buy bonds, lower the discount rate, so on and so forth, which increases the supply of money, because now it's down here. There's your interest rate once, and now the interest rate is decreased, so you've met your goal here. And then what the US government's going to do is, if they wanted interest rates to fall, they're going to demand less loans. They're going to cut back on the level of spending. There's your interest rate, and now your interest rate is lower. So, in summary, the federal government should pursue contractionary fiscal policy. They should demand less loans. They should cut back on the amount of money they're spending, while the Fed should increase the amount of spending. They should increase the money supply. They should increase the discount, increase the amount of money that's being pumped into the economy. Okay? Last slide for you. So in conclusion, what you need to know here, guys, again, isn't essentially new knowledge. It's being able to interpret a macroeconomic situation and being able to graph it out and analyze the graph, like I just did over the last couple. So if you're given a question of like the Fed and the U.S. Congress want to reduce inflation, how would they do that? You would have to think about the different types of policies, fiscal and monetary policy, look at them and think, all right, how would those cut price levels? What combination of the two would cut price levels? What combination of the two would increase aggregate demand? You have to be able to essentially just graph these things out to find the answer. If you're looking for more help, this is available to you as well. This is topic 5.1 from ACDC Econ, if you're looking at it. And tomorrow, you're welcome to jump on the Google Meet, and I can talk you through some of these AP Classroom questions. There's 13 of them regarding fiscal and monetary policy. So hope this helped, and talk to you soon.